Imagine being considered one of the greatest minds in human history, yet believing something so absurdly wrong that a 5-year-old today could prove you wrong in seconds. This is the story of how the most brilliant philosophers in ancient Greece, men who laid the foundation for Western thought, convinced themselves that women had fewer teeth than men. And here's the truly disturbing part. They never bothered to simply open a woman's mouth and count. What you're about to discover will make you question everything you thought you knew about ancient wisdom. Because sometimes, the smartest people can believe the most ridiculous things. Welcome back to the channel where we dig up history's most bizarre and shocking secrets. If you're new here, we explore the dark, twisted, and downright absurd truths that textbooks don't want to tell you. Today, we're traveling back to ancient Greece, the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and rational thought. Or so they claim, because what I'm about to reveal will shatter your image of these enlightened thinkers forever. We're talking about Aristotle. Yes, the Aristotle, the man who tutored Alexander the Great and whose ideas dominated Western thought for over 2,000 years. This same genius believed women were fundamentally inferior creatures, cold-blooded, less intelligent, and yes, that they had fewer teeth than men. But here's where it gets truly maddening. Aristotle was married, twice. He lived with women his entire life, yet never once thought to verify this scientific fact. Let's dive into this rabbit hole of ancient stupidity and discover how misogyny masqueraded as science in the ancient world. In his work, Historia Animalium, which translates to History of Animals, Aristotle wrote, and I quote, "Males have more teeth than females in the case of men, sheep, goats, and swine." Just let that sink in for a moment. The father of logic, the master of observation, the man whose scientific method influenced centuries of scholars, couldn't count teeth correctly. But here's what makes this even more insane. This wasn't some throwaway comment. Aristotle presented this as scientific fact in his comprehensive study of the natural world, a work that scholars treated as gospel for over 2 millennia. And because Aristotle said it, virtually every scholar who came after him just accepted it, without question, without verification. Medieval scholars cited it as proof of women's inferiority. Renaissance thinkers used it to justify keeping women uneducated. Even into the 1600s, learned men were still referencing Aristotle's dental mathematics as evidence that women were biologically inferior. Think about that. For over 2,000 years, some of history's most brilliant minds perpetuated a lie that any person could disprove by asking their wife to say, "Ah." To understand how this happened, you need to grasp just how twisted ancient Greek views of women really were. In Aristotle's mind, women weren't just different from men. They were failed men. Literally. He believed women were men who didn't develop properly in the womb due to lack of heat. According to his theory, women were colder than men and therefore less perfect, more irrational and emotional, physically weaker and smaller, and yes, incomplete in every way, including having fewer teeth. This wasn't science. This was prejudice dressed up in fancy philosophical language. Here's what's truly disturbing. Aristotle's claim about women's teeth reveals something much darker about ancient intellectual culture. These weren't stupid people. Ancient Greek philosophers could calculate the circumference of the earth, predict eclipses, and develop complex mathematical theorems. Yet when it came to women, they abandoned all critical thinking. Why? Because questioning Aristotle was like questioning God himself. Fast forward to medieval times and the situation gets even more absurd. Thomas Aquinas, the great Catholic theologian, incorporated Aristotle's teachings into Christian doctrine. Suddenly, women having fewer teeth wasn't just science, it was religious truth. Medieval medical texts solemnly repeated the claim. University professors taught it to generations of students. And all the while, every single one of these men had mothers, wives, sisters, and daughters whose mouths they could have examined. But they didn't. Because why would you question the master? What makes this even more maddening is that ancient Greeks were obsessed with physical perfection. They created the most realistic sculptures in human history. They studied anatomy for their art. Greek sculptors could carve marble to look like flesh. They understood muscle structure, bone placement, and human proportions with incredible precision. Yet none of them, not one, ever thought to count teeth while studying the human form. Of course, there was a deeper issue at play. In ancient Greek society, respectable women were largely kept in seclusion. Upper-class wives rarely appeared in public, and when they did, they were heavily veiled. The men making these scientific observations had limited contact with women outside of prostitutes and slaves, women they viewed as less than human anyway. So when Aristotle claimed women had fewer teeth, it fit perfectly with their existing prejudices. It confirmed what they already knew, that women were inferior, incomplete, and defective. Here's the actual truth that took humanity over 2,000 years to officially acknowledge. Adult humans typically have 32 teeth, regardless of sex. Women don't have fewer teeth than men. They never have. But here's where it gets interesting. There are some minor differences between male and female teeth. Men's teeth tend to be slightly larger. Men are more likely to have impacted wisdom teeth. Women's teeth may appear smaller due to smaller jaw size. But the number, exactly the same. Some modern scholars have tried to give Aristotle the benefit of the doubt. They theorize that maybe he was observing young people whose wisdom teeth hadn't erupted yet, and perhaps girls' wisdom teeth emerged later than boys'. But this is generous to the point of absurdity. Aristotle claimed this was true for sheep, goats, and pigs too. Was he examining adolescent livestock? Unlikely. Another theory suggests Aristotle might have been measuring tooth size rather than counting them. Since men's teeth are typically larger, maybe he concluded they had more teeth in terms of total dental mass. But again, this gives him far too much credit. He specifically wrote about numbers, not size. The man who could categorize hundreds of animal species couldn't count to 32. What makes this even more frustrating is that Aristotle actually developed many principles of scientific observation that we still use today. He emphasized the importance of direct observation, careful documentation, testing hypotheses, comparing multiple specimens. He applied this rigorous method to studying sea creatures, insects, and plant life. But when it came to women, all scientific rigor went out the window. The teeth myth didn't die with Aristotle. If anything, it got worse. Medieval scholars like Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas didn't just repeat the claim, they embellished it. They used it as evidence for increasingly elaborate theories about women's biological inferiority. Woman, being colder and moister in nature, produces fewer teeth, just as she produces weaker bones, softer flesh, and a less perfect form overall. This wasn't just scientific error anymore. It was systematic dehumanization disguised as academic discourse. Interestingly, some Islamic scholars during the medieval period actually began to question Aristotle's claims about women. Physicians like Al-Razi and Ibn Sina made direct anatomical observations that contradicted Greek authorities. These men were actually practicing real science, while European scholars were still genuflecting before ancient texts. But even in the Islamic world, challenging Aristotle was controversial. Most scholars continued to repeat his claims rather than risk their reputations. You might think the Renaissance, the age of scientific revolution, would have quickly debunked this myth. You'd be wrong. Even as Renaissance anatomists like Andreas Vesalius were revolutionizing medicine by actually dissecting human bodies, many still hesitated to contradict Aristotle on matters involving women. Vesalius corrected hundreds of Aristotelian errors about human anatomy. He proved that men don't have one fewer rib than women. He mapped the circulatory system accurately for the first time. But the teeth thing, that persisted well into the 1600s in some scholarly circles. Why was this particular myth so persistent? Because it wasn't really about teeth. The claim that women had fewer teeth was part of a larger ideological framework that justified male dominance. If women were biologically incomplete, if they literally had fewer parts than men, then treating them as inferior wasn't cruelty. It was just acknowledging natural law. This is how prejudice works. It doesn't just hate, it systematizes. It creates elaborate scientific justifications for treating other human beings as less than human. There was also an economic component. In societies where women could inherit property, hold political power, or compete economically with men, Proving their biological inferiority became crucial for maintaining male privilege. After all, if women were literally incomplete men with fewer teeth, smaller brains, and colder blood, how could they possibly be trusted with important decisions? The tide began to turn in the 17th century, not through grand pronouncements, but through quiet observations. Physicians who actually examined female patients began to notice discrepancies. Midwives, who had intimate knowledge of women's bodies, started sharing their observations with male doctors. Slowly, very slowly, empirical observation began to trump ancient authority. Interestingly, some of the strongest challenges to these myths came from women who had gained access to education. Writers like Christine de Pizan in the 15th century, and later scholars like Elena Cornaro-Piscopia, began systematically dismantling claims about female inferiority, though they had to be extremely careful not to appear too radical. By the time of the scientific revolution, the teeth myth was finally dying. But it took explicit efforts by people like Pierre Gassendi, who specifically refuted Aristotelian biological claims, Francesco Redi, who demonstrated the importance of controlled observation, Antony van Leeuwenhoek, whose microscopic observations revealed the complexity of human anatomy. These men didn't just discover new truths, they had to actively kill old lies. Even as the teeth myth died, its underlying assumptions persisted. The idea that women were biologically inferior simply shifted to new evidence. Smaller brain size, ignoring body proportion. Different skull shape, ignoring individual variation. Hormonal differences exaggerated beyond recognition. The specific claims changed, but the prejudice remained constant. The story of Aristotle's teeth isn't really about dental anatomy. It's about how intelligent people can believe incredibly stupid things when those beliefs serve their interests. Think about it. The man who created the foundations of logic couldn't count teeth correctly. The philosopher who taught us to question everything never questioned his own prejudices. This case reveals a fundamental flaw in how humans process information. We tend to believe authority figures even when their claims are easily verifiable. This isn't just an ancient problem. Today we see the same pattern with medical myths that persist despite easy disproval, economic theories that ignore obvious contradictions, political claims that collapse under basic scrutiny. The tools for verification are there, but we often choose to believe rather than verify. Most disturbing of all, this story reveals how prejudice can create literal blindness. These men lived with women every day, but couldn't see them clearly enough to count their teeth. When we decide someone is inferior, we stop seeing them as fully human. We stop noticing details that contradict our prejudices. We become willfully ignorant. Before we get too smug about ancient ignorance, ask yourself, what obvious truths are we missing today because they contradict our assumptions? What groups of people do we systematically underestimate or misunderstand? What scientific facts do we accept without verification because they confirm what we already believe? The capacity for Aristotelian blindness didn't die with the ancient Greeks. It lives in all of us. So there you have it, the absurd story of how history's greatest philosophers convinced themselves that women had fewer teeth than men. The ultimate irony? Aristotle, the man who gave us the principles of logical reasoning, committed one of the most basic logical fallacies, accepting a premise without evidence. He had the tools to discover the truth, he had the access, he had the opportunity, but he chose prejudice over perception, authority over observation, comfort over curiosity. This story isn't just ancient history, it's a warning. It shows us how easily intelligence can be corrupted by bias, how quickly wisdom can become willful ignorance. The next time someone in authority makes a claim about any group of people, whether it's about gender, race, class, or anything else, remember Aristotle's teeth. Ask yourself, is this based on careful observation or comfortable assumption? Are we seeing clearly, or are we blinded by what we want to believe? Oh, and by the way, just in case you were wondering, both men and women typically have 32 teeth as adults. Aristotle was wrong, completely, embarrassingly, obviously wrong. Sometimes the greatest minds produce the greatest nonsense. The key is having the courage to count for ourselves. If you enjoyed this dive into historical absurdity, make sure to like and subscribe for more shocking truths from the past. What other wise ancient beliefs do you think were completely ridiculous? Let me know in the comments below. Next week, we're exploring why Roman doctors believed that gladiator blood could cure epilepsy. And yes, people actually drank it. Until then, keep questioning, keep counting, and remember, sometimes the smartest people believe the dumbest things.